All right, welcome to this talk about running Blazor in production and the lessons learned. So, some people love Blazor, and let's just face it, some haven't tried it yet. So, how many of you have tried Blazor before? Oh, almost everyone, okay. How many wants to use Blazor? So, how is that not more? So there are people that tried Blazor that don't want to use. Okay, never mind. So how many of you are a little bit unsure about Blazor? What is this stuff? I don't know. Yeah, a couple of you. Okay, awesome. My name is Jim Engström. I'm a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. I just switched areas, and we've been running Blazor in production since, well, 7 days after its release. I run a podcast called Coding After Work together with my lovely wife. And we also do a stream on Twitch. So if you want to see us code Blazor stuff and interview some awesome guests, please check that out. We're actually building a call for paper site right now with using Blazor and RavenDB. I've written a book about Blazor, and I'm currently writing a second edition, which will come out in March, I think, around there. And these are the only 2 Blazor books that has raccoons on the cover. It's important. Okay, we're here to talk about Blazor. Let's go back to 2017, when Steve Sanderson had a WebAssembly talk at NDC Oslo. And he thought, you know what, it would be kind of cool to show something like running .NET in the web browser. Wouldn't that be kind of a cool demo? So when he takes the stage, he has working Visual Studio support. He has even the name Blazor, which is not a lot of names stick around for that long. So even the name Blazor, and he had running C# code inside of the browser. He took an open source project of the .NET runtime, compiled that to WebAssembly, and then ran the .NET DLLs right there in the web browser. That's kind of cool. So why is Blazor awesome? Well, I saw a Reddit post that kind of embodied and really got that message across. It said, "This feels like cheating. I feel like I'm getting away with something. And it shouldn't be this easy to build sites." How many feel the same? Okay, yeah, bunch of you. And I mean, me included, I'm not that comfortable with writing JavaScript. I don't like switching between JavaScript and TypeScript. But the nice thing with Blazor here is that I don't have to. There's no extra framework I need to download, and I don't need any extra skills like Angular or React. So for me, this is like the perfect solution. Now, I read somewhere that Blazor is for developers that don't want to learn new things. And for me, that is not the case. I love learning new things, but to be fair, I kind of tend to stay in the C# stack. But there's a saying that misfortune never comes alone. And for me, that misfortune is NPM, Webpack, TypeScript, JavaScript, Bower, Angular, all these other technologies that I need to be the best at to be able to do work, basically. So for me, Blazor is removing clutter, making me focus on what I need to do. And, well, that's where Blazor comes in. I got a friend request on Facebook. And since I'm out talking at conferences like this, I'm sure I've probably met this person. So he said, so, are you working with Blazor? Yeah, I am. Someone perhaps saw my talk or read my book or whatever. So I thought, yes, I'm working with Blazor. Never going to be a thing. That's good to know. I just invested half my life basically here, so that's good to know. But I asked him, well, why do you think, why is this not going to be a thing? Well, he said, well, it's never going to beat Angular or React. Well, kind of not the point. It's kind of more letting us as C# developers do interactive websites with the knowledge we already have, without context switching and all of that. I mean, there can be more than one SPA framework. This is not Highlander. This is technology, right? And Blazor isn't really just another framework. It's part of .NET. And as .NET developers, I'm assuming most of you are .NET developers? Yeah? Huh? There's no reason not to think about Blazor. Try Blazor out, because it's a very mature technology at this point. We're still kind of saying, like, Blazor is a Microsoft new technology for SPA framework. Well, it's 3 years old now. There's a lot of frameworks that doesn't reach 3 years. So I don't know, is it still new? I teach at a school, I've been trying to say that word for so long and I never managed to say it. Accelerated learning, there we go, too much caffeine. So basically we have someone that have never seen a code at all. They come in, they get to become a developer in 12 weeks, basically. I mean, they're not senior developers, but they are developers in 12 weeks. So I asked them, would you like me to come in and teach Blazor? I would love to do that. And no one is asking about Blazor. No, we have people asking for Angular, we have people asking for React. They do teach ASP.NET, of course, but no one is asking for Blazor. And that's kind of the point. They're asking for ASP.NET. Blazor is part of ASP.NET. It should be in there. But Blazor has another problem, and that is we can run Blazor on so many things. We can run it on the server, we can run it in WebAssembly, and now we can run it in Blazor Hybrid with .NET MAUI. And this leads into kind of naming problem, because we're saying that we're using Blazor, but what part of Blazor are we using? I contacted a podcast and I said, you know what, I would be happy to be a guest on your podcast. We can talk about Blazor, talk about all these really cool technologies. And the reply was, well, we just talked about WebAssembly, so we don't want another WebAssembly talk or a guest. And I'm like, but that's just one way of running Blazor. We can run it on so much more, but okay. So last year at NDC London, we recorded a podcast with Steve Sanderson, and I asked him, so what kind of trends are you seeing? Are you seeing the same? Because when I talk to companies say that, well, we're using Blazor Server. Not a lot of companies are investing in WebAssembly that I've talked to. So I asked him, do you see the same trends? Is this happening with the people you talk to as well? And he said, yeah. Most people or most companies are running Blazor Server. Now, to be fair, Blazor Server was around like a year before WebAssembly, I think. So it has a little bit of a head start. And WebAssembly is growing really fast. So it's not really like saying like you should invest in Blazor Server, you should invest in Blazor WebAssembly, but a lot of these talks talks like this, books, blog posts, they talk about very heavily about WebAssembly, like that's the only option. But it's not. We also have Blazor Server. So let's dive in and just figure out where all of these different technologies comes in. So we have Blazor Server. Let's start with that. So we have the server, and on the server we have Razor components. Then we have Blazor. So Blazor is taking whatever the Razor components is outputting and put them into a render tree. So, okay, so it knows what's going on and what kind of elements we have. So let's say that we have an H1 and a button. Because why not? And then we have the browser, and on the browser side we have a DOM. We have a little piece of JavaScript, which is responsible to set up a SignalR connection to the server. So there are some downsides, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. So the render tree knows what it actually has sent over, so it's just going to send, in this case we don't have anything in the DOM, we're going to send over the H1, the button, and the JavaScript is then going to update the DOM. Awesome. So let's say that I click the button. That request, or that trigger, will go over the JavaScript, over SignalR, up to the Razor components. It's going to execute some kind of code, which is then going to update the DOM, or the render tree. In this case, it's a very subtle change. I changed Blazor rules to an S instead of a Z. Blazor is then going to push only that change over to the JavaScript and then update the DOM. This is not entirely true, because it actually, I think it's 3 requests happening. It's one that says the button click, the data back, and then an acknowledgement saying, okay, I got that. And it's not sending the actual H1 tag and all of that, but in general, it sends the update to the server. So when it comes to WebAssembly, we need to understand how JavaScript works just a little bit. So what happens is that we download the JavaScript, we parse the JavaScript either from a file or from inline, and then it's going to get compiled, and then the JIT interpreter is going to run the code. With WebAssembly, we kind of bypass some of those steps, because the JIT interpreter can run WebAssembly right there. So what Microsoft did was that they took the Mono runtime, compiled that to .NET, to WebAssembly to .NET.wasm, and then that WebAssembly code is running our DLLs and the framework DLLs right there in the web browser. So when I realized this, it's running the whole runtime inside the browser. That felt a little bit wrong to me. But then I realized that if you just say it another way, it's running the whole runtime inside of the browser. That is kind of cool. But what we also can do is we can, with .NET 6, we got ahead of time compilation. So basically, we can remove the DLLs and put everything and compile everything to WebAssembly. Now the downside is, of course, that the WebAssembly file is going to be a lot larger, but it's going to load and execute things super, super fast, really, really fast. So back to the server, this is how the Blazor Server worked. WebAssembly, we're only changing the way we're hosting things. Now everything lives inside of the browser. The .NET.wasm is running our Razor components, running Blazor, creating the render tree. We still have the DOM, we still have a little piece of JavaScript, but instead of SignalR, we're getting JavaScript interrupts, because as of now, WebAssembly don't have direct access to the DOM, so that's what's happening. So it's pretty similar in how it's working, just where it's running that differs. So what about Blazor Hybrid? Well, so let's have WebAssembly as a starting point. So for .NET Malware or Blazor Hybrid, we can now run inside of iOS, Android, macOS, Windows, and even Tyson. It's running inside of .NET MAUI. We have .NET for iOS, or .NET for Android, running our Razor components. This is the same DLLs that we've been talking about. Still, we've got Blazor. We still have a render tree. We can combine native components together with web or DOM elements. So here's where things get really cool. So with the same Razor components, the same Razor component library, we can reach Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly through the web. Using .NET MAUI, we can reach iOS, Android, macOS, Tyson, and Windows. And using WebView, we can even use WinForms or WPF as well. So we can use all of these things together with our Blazor libraries. It's kind of cool, huh? I see people nodding. So what about this? This is kind of the promise, right? No more JavaScript. I would say this is a kind of a little bit of a myth, but it depends on where you're coming from. So if you're coming from MVC and you're coming from Razor pages, it might be a little bit more JavaScript than you were used to. Because especially in the beginning with the .NET 5, for example, there were some things that we needed JavaScript to do. For one example is changing the page title. That they fixed that, thank God. But there are some things we still need JavaScript to access, native resources, native Bluetooth, for example. So it's not entirely true that we never need to see JavaScript, but the Blazor community is quite large. So chances are that someone has built it, what we need already. So we went into production 7 days after Blazor was general availability, and we felt that there were some things that were missing. So we built our own grid component, which meant that we needed a little bit of JavaScript in there. So I've written, I usually say that when I started working with Blazor, I have never written as much JavaScript as when I started working with Blazor. So this is definitely not true for me, but it can be for many people. Now the really cool thing is that it's still possible to use JavaScript. So if you have your favorite JavaScript framework, you have or components or something like that, you can still do that. You can still do JavaScript interrupts. Now, I would perhaps not recommend mixing languages, but it is possible. Because with .NET 7, we got something called web components. And this works both ways. So this means that I can bring in Angular or React, or actually it's completely another technology, but web components into, JavaScript web components, I should say, into our Blazor project, as well as create Blazor components that I can use in my JavaScript libraries. So if we're kind of porting something, we're moving towards, heck, we might be moving towards Angular or React, or we're moving towards Blazor, we can use all these technologies together. Again, I'm not sure that I recommend it, but it is possible. I would probably use it in a transition phase, but I kind of like that it's possible. So I did a video on TikTok, and I said, is Blazor production ready? And basically said yes. And I got comments. So there was a guy that had some really great feedback. So he said, no, it's not going to be a thing. I'm going to lose, I think he used 70% of all the things in Angular moving to Blazor. And I'm like, yeah, is that really a thing? I have done very little with Angular. I've definitely done almost a little bit more in React, but still, I don't know that space. So I was a little bit curious. So what are the things that you're missing? What are those 70% that just goes away? So one of the things was Angular material. So I tried to look this up. What is it? How does it work? Do we have it? And yes, we do. We have Math Blazor and we have Mud Blazor. So both of those are, I don't know if they're equivalent, but it's something in the same lines. Angular Flex. There's an open source project called Flexor, which works great for Blazor. We have Angular Animation, and we used to have something called Blazor Animate, but it's now part of Blazorize. So we still have that. Perhaps not as good, I don't know, but it's still there. Unit testing was one of the things that I was really, we've had that from the start. Eagle Hansen here made an awesome framework for testing your Blazor components that doesn't spin up a web browser and all of that. You can really test it without, it's super easy and super great. And if you didn't see Eagle's session on this Wednesday, right? You should definitely check that out because it was really great. Routing. We have that. That's kind of a base thing. Apparently, you need to add that to Angular or something. I don't know. HTTP. Well, we have that too. Directives. We don't have that. I'm not entirely sure what the benefits are. Perhaps you know, but. And the last one was pipes. And as from what I understand, it's like formatting text and things like that. We kind of have that in .NET, but not as easy perhaps. But we do have that. Okay, so one of the questions I get a lot is, should we write our code in the Razor file or in code behind? So what are you doing? Razor file? Code behind? It's about 50-50, okay? So when Blazor came out, it was a lot of things. The main examples was to write it in the Razor file. And I set off and I said, you know what, I don't like this. I'm going to go code behind because that's what I'm used to. Separation of concerns and all of that. And then I said to myself, if Microsoft says we should use Razor files, or they didn't really do that, but in all their samples they used Razor files. So you know what? I'm going to try it. I'm going to give it a couple of weeks. I'm going to try it. And the fact that I don't have to context switch or switch files and just work in the same file. Some people say, yeah, but having all that code inside of with the markup, then you should probably move that into a service or something like that anyways, because you want it to be testable and stuff like that. But I would encourage you, those of you who are running code behind, try to run it in Razor file, because what happens is that it's going to take the Razor files, it's going to convert that to C# code, it's going to take your code behind, mash them together, and then compile it. So it's kind of not any separations anyways. So it's just a mental separation in this case. So it boosted our productivity a lot. This is a question I get a lot. So, hi Jimmy, we are just about to start with Blazor. What component library should we use? Well, file new? I'm all for like trying out, you need to understand the components, how they work, how to work with components before you get into a component library. Now, having said that, there are a lot of vendors that invest time and money into components. We have Progress, DevExpress, Syncfusion, Radson, Blazorize, Matt Blazor, Mud Blazor, and the bottom one is the grid that I did. So that's open source if you want to check that out. It might be a good example to show how, I mean, a grid is a fairly advanced control, so you can see how you could build that from scratch if you want to. Now, building a component library is not a good idea. I mean, there's a lot of awesome people doing this for a living. In our case, we had a couple of special things that we needed. We needed sorting. Well, that's kind of a given. We needed sign highlighting. So we wanted positive numbers, we wanted them to be blue, and negative numbers wanted to be red, for example. And instead of having that as a special column renderer or whatever, it was super easy for us to just highlight sign equals true, and we were done. We also had different, we wanted people to use it on the web, on a computer or a tablet, and we wanted people to be able to use it on the phone. So we built in functionality to remove columns. So if the size gets smaller, we can remove some columns and put them beneath. I haven't seen that at least in a lot of different vendors. I'm sure they're out there, but that was one of the things we needed. But back then, when we started this, there were none of those kinds of functionalities. But you should make your own components. And I'm not saying that you should make your own grid, but I'm saying that everything you build should be in a component. Now, in the web form days and stuff like that, building component libraries or components was kind of tricky. But with Blazor, that's the kind of things you need to think about, because everything is components. So think in a component-centric way. Can this code be reused? Am I writing the same code twice for some reason? And the real benefit is to have the whole team do the same things. So what we did was that we created our own button. So I never understood why we should do an own button. I mean, it's kind of simple to do that, right? But in this case, this is just a HTML button. It's using the BTN and BTM primary. This is from Bootstrap. So we are saving a customer. Is that a primary button or is it a success button? We were deleting a customer, we're doing something dangerous. Is it danger or is it not as dangerous to do that? Could we use the primary anyway? So instead of having like all these things that we need to remember and the whole team needs to remember that, we created our own component. So we're basically saying that we have an enum. If it's a default button, then we're going to use the BTN primary. If it is a save button, we're going to use the BTN primary again. If it's a cancel button, it's a danger button, because canceling stuff is dangerous. And if it's a delete button, same thing there. So by doing this kind of abstraction, we not only help ourselves because we know that we're saving something. We don't need to remember if it's primary, danger, success, whatever. If we're changing from Bootstrap, only need to change this one. When we upgraded from Bootstrap 4 something to 5, there were some changes that happened. Only one place to change it, which was saved a lot of time. So here comes my advice. Components everywhere. Build components, build reusable components. Try to build helper components like the one I just showed you. That doesn't add any functionality, but it adds an abstraction layer that makes it easier to understand and to follow. My boss came to me and he said, okay, I know we just jumped on Blazor, but is this something that Microsoft is going to abandon next week? And I'm like, I don't know. I hope not. But I mean, they're investing a lot of time into that. You saw the list of component vendors, and that's probably just half the list. But I get that question a lot. Does companies use Blazor? I would not be able to mention any companies that are using Angular or React because companies are not talking about that. Obviously, the maintainers, Google and Twitter and stuff like that. But I would not be able to tell you what technology they're using. But I can tell you this, that big Swedish companies, I'm not allowed to say what company, are using Blazor today. Internally, they're using Blazor Server, and we're talking about a Swedish company that you all have heard of. That's the level of Swedish company we're talking about. I have a lot of friends working in a consultancy business, and they are using Blazor. They have lots of customers using Blazor. I did a workshop for a consultancy agency, and then they have like 10 different customers that are using Blazor. So yes, people and companies are using Blazor. They're not talking about it though. So let's compare the different technologies. So I've decided to compare Blazor Server with Blazor WebAssembly because these are the two web technologies. It's kind of comparing Blazor Hybrid into this doesn't make sense to me. So the first thing with Blazor Server is that it has a fast startup. It doesn't have anything to download, it's just a small JavaScript and you're running it. You can use the full server capabilities. So that means that you can get to databases, you can get to the file system or whatever you want to do. The browser support at least was a little bit better with Blazor Server. I'm not sure actually what it is with .NET 7, but it was a little bit more versions had support for that. Your code is safe. It's running on the server. You can't decompile it unless you have access to the server. And this is a little bit controversial perhaps, but I really like the fact that you can call the database directly. You don't need an API, or a web API I should say. You should definitely do it an API thing, but not a web API. So the bad thing is that you need a constant connection with SignalR. I saw a demo from Steve Sanderson on Twitter, I believe, or YouTube, it was on YouTube, where he showed some of the things that are coming in .NET 8, and some of these things are actually, they have solutions for some of these things coming up. It doesn't have offline support because of the first rule. You need a constant connection. It does have a little bit of higher latency because when you click a button, it goes back to the server renders everything and pushes that back to the client. We have never heard that Blazor is slow because of Blazor. We have had server problems and slow databases and all of that, but never never for the reason that we're running Blazor Server. Since everything is on the server, we have user states, we have the connections and all of that stuff, and the render tree and everything, it does have a higher server load. And it requires ASP.NET on the server. I don't know if that's bad, but it does. So for WebAssembly, you can definitely do PWA, which is kind of nice. You can run it anywhere. So you can run it on GitHub Pages. You can run it on Azure Static Web Apps. You can run it from a file share, which is kind of nice. You don't need to do any round trips to the server. We have ahead of time compilation, which I mentioned in the beginning. So we can speed things up. It's insanely fast. It does have a large footprint, and we will get back to that in a bit as well. You need an API. You can't do direct database access. And again, it's controversial. You might like that, you might not like that, but your code is not safe. It's .NET DLLs, they can be decompiled quite easily. But that's kind of the thing that all JavaScript developers had for years, so it's not a new thing, but if you're coming from MVC and a Blazor Pages world, you kind of need to think about where are my logic? Can I have it on the client? Is this secret in any way? So let's talk a little bit more about the server. So I mentioned that the server load goes up a little bit. So when it comes to memory consumption, what's happening is that it's saving all the state on the server for all the users that is connected to the server. When, let's say, the database goes down for some kind of reason, what do the people do then? What do the users do? Well, they start pressing F5. Frantically. Ask me how I know. And what happens then is that the signal or connection is going to be disconnected. It's going to reload the page. It's going to hook up another connection, and the old one is going to be there for, by default, 3 minutes, taking up space. And then when they do that, like, come on, come on, it's like a million connections right there. So the advice here is to add a refresh button. Now, since in our case the SQL Server was down, it wouldn't help, but don't let your users press F5. Try to add a refresh button with, oh, I'm going to press that button, it's going to refresh, and everything is awesome. Don't mix Blazor and non-Blazor pages. We did that in the beginning. So what happened is that kind of the same logic, you have a Blazor page or a Blazor component, which is routed all through Blazor. You move to an MVC page or a Razor page, it's going to disconnect that. And you're going to reload the site, it's going to disconnect the connection, and when you move back, it's going to connect again. So try not to mix different technologies, even though it is possible, but you need to think about that a little bit. Now, the really cool thing with Blazor was that we got a completely different kind of feedback. Because they said, hey, nothing is happening. I pressed the button and nothing's happening. And we're like, yeah, you saved the same thing 7 times. That's what happened. Because we didn't think about, because with MVC and Razor pages, the whole page reloaded, they understood that something happened when I pressed the button. But with Blazor, when I pressed the button, nothing happened because it didn't reload the whole page. It did stuff, but it didn't reload the whole page. And so that was the first kind of realization that, oh, this is kind of cool. This is an interactive website now. The second thing that happened was that, okay, so I'm updating something in this completely different system that we're syncing into our database, but this completely different system. Why do I need to update this page? So our user kind of get used to everything happening with SignalR. We could push changes into the web browser. And they were like, we want this. This is why do we have to reload? Why do we have to press the refresh button? And that kind of like blew my mind, because that change was, we're talking about weeks until they kind of demanded that the UI should update directly, which is kind of cool. So the advice here is make sure you notify the user, tell the user that something happened. This post is saved or whatever it may be. The development speed using Blazor compared to, in our case, MVC, saved our project, I would say. We were doing a very huge change of the back office system, and there were other companies that were doing the same change. We were 6 developers, I think, and they had 10 more resources, and we were done before them because we didn't context switch. We stayed in Blazor, we were productive in Blazor. And in some cases, it was even faster to actually move the functionality to Blazor rather than fix the problem in MVC, which is kind of cool. So one of the things I also hear is Blazor Server slow? Well, we talked about that, we touched on that subject, and we never got that feedback. If you have really bad connection, that would probably be a problem. But if we have, I mean, the connection here, the connection in Sweden, it works. Now, I was at a conference in Sweden. I was talking to a couple of guys that came up to me and said, so we're thinking about doing Blazor Server, please advise us. And they had 2 things that they needed. They needed, it had to work offline. And it had to work with millions of users. Now these 2 things are the top 2 things that Blazor Server can't do, or is really bad at least. Can't do offline, and millions of users is definitely going to be lots of load on the server. So I explained, well, you should definitely go with WebAssembly in that case. So Blazor Server is not for everyone. So what about WebAssembly? So let's talk about the specific things. Footprint, or the loading time. I went on Facebook and I asked, what kind of questions would you like to have answered? And that was one of the top questions. The footprint. All of these DLLs that needs to get downloaded, that's like 1 megabyte of WebAssembly stuff, right? So I thought, you know what? I want to know what other sites do. Is this really a problem? So Facebook has 16 megabytes of JavaScript compared to the WebAssembly runtime, which is around 1 megabyte. 16, that's 16 times more, right? Pinterest has a little bit more than 6 megabytes. YouTube, 4 megabytes. Twitter has a little bit more than 3 megabytes. Stack Overflow, 1.5. Apple's homepage, a little bit more than 1. And Blazor comes out, the Blazor demo site, I should say, comes in at 1.2 back then. I think it's even lower now. So when we're talking about the footprint, like, oh, it's 1 megabyte, that is not really a problem. What is a problem is the loading time, because it takes a little bit of time to spin everything up. Again, ahead of time compilation will help. So what can we do? Well, we can add a progress bar, because as long as you're telling your customers that something is happening, it's fine. In the .NET 7 template, the new one, they added a progress bar for us. So that's kind of We got that one. We can use server pre-render. So we can use Blazor Server rendering everything for us, pushing that to the web browser, and then when WebAssembly is finished loading, it will just switch out. We can use Mr. Sakamoto's pre-renderer, which is taking our site when we are publishing it, rendering everything, and then adds it to the WebAssembly. So it's perfect for SEOs, but it's not good for dynamic content. But that's an option. Or we can do ahead of time compilation, which is going to load a whole. The footprint is bigger, the load time is smaller. So depending on where you are, I guess. So we are in the UK. And I just have to show you one of my projects that I've been working on. It's called ZXbox, and there's a story behind that. When I was 7 years old, my parents got me my first computer, a ZX Spectrum. And one of the things that I thought that this was super cool, so I started making an emulator for the Xbox. That's where the Xbox comes from. And this has kind of become my hello world. So every new technology I encounter, I have a HoloLens one, I have a .NET Micro Framework one. So every new technology I encounter, can I implement my C# Spectrum emulator in that new technology? So I want to show you. Spoilers, I could. So here it is. So if you want to try it out, no, you can't see that. Let's actually do it like this. There we go. Awesome. So I started off with a 48K and then the 128K. And this is running Blazor WebAssembly, and it's running ahead of time compiled. So let's just reload the page and see the time it takes. Boom. Again, everything is already downloaded, so the first download was what took a little bit of time, but this is the experience when you go back to the site the second time. Boom. Pretty fast. And this is not the out-of-the-box, really, really simple demo. So let's kick it off. Let's see if we can do something. And before I load Manic Miner, I just want to say that. So I did a lot of Windows Phone development and Windows 8 development. So I did a lot of games for a company here in the UK called Ultimate. No? Elite, sorry, Elite. Not Ultimate. Ultimate is my favorite company, though. And I have, yet to this day, never beaten the first level of Manic Miner. Has anyone done that? No one? Ah, one. It's always one. I cannot for the life of me beat the first level. Let's kick it off. Let's see here. There we go. And it does have sound. I have muted it because it's kind of annoying. Let's see if I can unmute it. Can you hear it back? Let's mute that. And it's obvious I can move around. Let's see if I can figure out the keys here. Oh, there we go. And I can move around. And jump and stuff. And die. One day, I should beat this. Right, let's jump back. There we go. So do we have any questions? Yes?
In a nutshell, what's the approach you mentioned? Server pre-render and then flip into WebAssembly? Is that straightforward?
so the question is, what's the approach when doing server pre-render and then switch into WebAssembly? It is super simple. One of the things that if you just do it, basically what you need to do is you need to say that the first you need to change the index HTML to a Razor page. When you add the tag for the Blazor part of the site, you need to say server pre-rendered or something like that. So just doing that will basically do what you need. The problem is that what is going to happen is that it's going to load the server side, and when the WebAssembly is done, it's going to do a request again and load everything again. But there is something called preserve. Oh, I should know this. Preserve state or something like that. That will, you can just add that to the Razor page and add a little bit. You need to rewrite the code just a little bit. What happens is that it's going to take the state of the component, it's going to render that in base 64 on the page, and when WebAssembly starts up, it's going to take that state, load that state, and it's not going to load the same data twice. So it's pretty straightforward, but you need to change the code just a little bit. Any other questions? Yes?
What sort of size of application data?
Sorry, once again?
What sort of size of application data do I have? Like, say I had a grid with like 80,000 rows, and they're all grouped arbitrarily by the columns, and like I don't know, 20 columns wide or something, and every 30 seconds 5,000 update. Is that reasonable?
Are we talking Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly? So the question is, if we have lots of rows in a grid and they're grouped and we're going to update it in a fairly fast pace, is it doable? Well, it's not less doable with any other technology. When it comes to pushing from the server, I would not recommend doing a lot of push of data because it takes resources. When it comes to WebAssembly, we're probably talking about pulling the information more, or you can implement SignalR and do that. But there are also built-in functionality, which is called virtualize, which is basically going to take that grid and only render those rows that are visible inside of the screen, and render like a div above and beneath, so that you can, so it looks correct, but it only renders part of it. But absolutely, it's possible. I see no problem with that, with the technology in itself. Yes?
You may have hinted at it, but are there any solutions coming for when you're pushing a change to production, it kills SignalR, so anyone using it just gets kicked off effectively?
So the question is there coming something that solves the problem with Blazor Server? Basically, when we push an update, you will, the connection is going to get killed off, and well, you're going to lose the state. Not that I know of. It's really a problem. So there are two things happening. So one of the things that is that the user is going to get kicked off, and you're going to create a new session or a new connection. The other thing is that you're going to be down for, I think I timed it to 7 seconds or something like that when we're publishing something in production. But as far as I know, no. Still going to need the connection. Yes?
I just want to add a comment to that. So the problem is that when you push an update to the application would presumably need to be reloaded anyway. But what you could do is you could look into technologies like app slots on Azure, for example, so that the existing apps that are active right now, they keep running until the user logs off, and then the next time they come in, they will go to the new version of the application.
So Eagle added for the people at home, you can use app slots to basically publish your new site and then make your users switch over to the new one. Any other questions? Yes?
Has there been any talk of doing tree shaking with IoT completion?
I think there are some tree shaking happening when you are compiling to IoT, but I'm not entirely.
There is some.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions? If you have any more questions, please come up to me. I have stickers. And so, just to summarize, should we go all in Blazor? Well, I'm going to give you the Microsoft answer. It depends. It depends on what you're doing, your team and stuff like that. Is it production ready? Yes. Should you invest time in it? Yes. Will it replace Angular React Vue? For some people, yes. So please hit me up, talk to me if you want to. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you so much.